Well, when we look at 1915 and what happened, this was really one of the first great atrocities of the 20th century. There were more than 2 million Armenians living in what's now the eastern part of Turkey, eastern Anatolia, and basically within a few years there were none left. They'd either been killed, deported, or assimilated, and many of them went to the Middle East, many of them went west, which is why we have such large Armenian diaspora in the United States, particularly in California and Massachusetts. Many of them went to Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, Eastern Armenia, which then became part of the Soviet Union. That border was then closed in Soviet times during the Cold War, and this issue then really started to come back only with full force when Armenia got independence in 1991. So we're looking at a great kind of historical black spot. Now, it has to be said, this was an incredibly complex period during the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Muslims, Turks also died, sometimes at the hands of Armenians. So although Armenians were the biggest losers out of this great tragedy, they certainly weren't the only losers. And this is one reason why Turkey has really been in denial about this, because Turks also suffered, and because also Turkey was basically founded on the fact that it escaped being dismembered by Christian powers, including the Russians who were supporting the Armenians. So it's a very historically complex period. And only in the last few years, with the end of the Soviet Union, changes within Turkey and independence of Armenia, have the two sides really been able to look at it. Unfortunately, we then got stuck on another issue, which was the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan is also a Turkic nation. Azeri and Turkish are very close languages. So Azerbaijan was Turkey's natural new ally in the region, the Caucasus. Armenia and Azerbaijan also have a lot of historical issues, and in particular over the disputed territory of Nagorny Karabakh, and the two countries went to war over that territory in the early 90s. Turkey backed its Turkic ally Azerbaijan, and in 1993, after one Armenian operation which captured a large Azerbaijani province, in solidarity with their Azerbaijani neighbours, the Turks closed the border. So we have two issues laid one on top of the other. One, what happened in 1915, that huge tragedy during the First World War, and then a more recent, lesser but also tragic history of the early 1990s, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. Armenia basically suspended the process of normalization with Turkey. Suspended but did not kill off. This was definitely the least of two options. They were angry that the Turks weren't moving forward with this historic normalization process, which would involve opening the border, and that the Turks were not going to ratify the agreement signed last October in Zurich. So the question for the Armenians was, they were taking a lot of domestic heat on this issue. The President Serge Sargsyan. The question was, would they walk away from the process altogether, or would they merely suspend their participation in the process? They chose the latter, so they've left the door ajar, and they can come back to it, and everyone is assuming that this process could get back on track next year when the Turks are a bit more comfortable after the Turkish elections. So this means that obviously hopes have been dashed. Many people hoped that this great historical normalization would go through. The two parliaments would ratify this document that the foreign ministers had signed, and we would be getting an opening of the closed border. What we're getting is a pause in the process, but not a full stop. The fear was that we would end up in a worse place than where we started, that there would be a lot of recriminations and mistrust, and this process would be stalled for many years. What we have now is obviously not a great solution, because the process is stalled, but it does mean, one, that the Armenia and Turkey can get back to this when they're more comfortable, when they see progress in other areas, which makes them feel more secure about going back to this. And secondly, that other kinds of contacts can continue. This is one of the success stories about this process. Turkey's opened up a great deal in the last few years, been looking at its past, including the dark issue of what happened in 1915 to the Ottoman Armenians. And there's been a lot of people-to-people contact. The taboo has been broken in Turkey on discussing the Armenian issue. There was this internet campaign which 30,000 people have signed an internet statement of apology to Armenians. So the dialogue has begun on the level of societies, and that will continue now that the Armenians have taken a step back from the process, but they haven't killed off the process. This process started quietly with mediation by Switzerland a couple of years ago, getting the two sides together for some quiet talks. And they were able to move forward, start to look at a roadmap. The US actually only got involved basically in the spring of 2009. Every year, Armenian-Turkish relations reach a kind of boiling point over April 24th, which is marked as Armenian Genocide Day, the day in 1915 when hundreds of Armenian intellectuals were rounded up and killed as the beginning of the process of this deportation and killing of Armenians in Turkey at that time. So every April 24th, the temperature hots up. The US president issues a statement on that day honouring the Armenian victims, and that statement is poured over in Turkey. They are outraged by the statement because it suggests that Turkey committed grave crimes. Armenians, on the contrary, are outraged by the statement because it does not mention the word, traditionally does not mention the word genocide, which is the big demand of Armenian lobbies in the US. So April 22nd, 2009, a roadmap was announced which simultaneously moved the Armenia-Turkey process forward and also took the pressure off the Turks because of this process. The US president was not going to use the word genocide. So that was the beginning, April 22nd, 2009. They then managed to sign protocols in October 2009 in Zurich, mediated by the Swiss, but already with the big guns there, with the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was also there. So suddenly the big powers were also putting their weight behind this normalization process. Things then started to get stuck when Azerbaijan started using all the levers it could in Turkey to try and derail this process. They were very unhappy, very worried about what it meant for them. And we then had April 24th coming around again this year, lots of lobbying, and the two leaders, Armenian President Sargsyan, Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan, meeting at the beginning of April in Washington on the sidelines of President Obama's nuclear summit, trying to see if they could bridge their differences, but they couldn't. The big problem here, the pebble in the shoe which keeps on coming back, is the Armenian-Azerbaijaini conflict over Nagorny Karabakh. Basically, this conflict has tied up the whole South Caucasus region since the late 80s, early 90s. It shouldn't be forgotten, it actually started in 1988. Initially it was a problem for Mikhail Gorbachev when this small province with an Armenian majority had autonomy inside Soviet Azerbaijan. They lobbied to become part of Soviet Armenia. This started off as a political dispute, then there were pogroms in Azerbaijan, then there was violence, exchange of populations, and it basically escalated into a full-scale war over this province of Karabakh in 1991 as the Soviet Union broke up. Armenians then won that war in 1994 and conquered, keeping control not only of Karabakh, the disputed province itself, but because Karabakh is an enclave, they also conquered Azerbaijani regions outside Karabakh, from which hundreds of thousands of literally Azerbaijanis fled. So and that's where we are today. The Armenians still are in control not only of Karabakh, but this whole zone of Azerbaijan around Karabakh. And Turkey, in solidarity with Azerbaijan, closed its border with Armenia during the war to support the Azerbaijanis. And so the two processes are not formally linked, but of course everyone knows that in some ways they are linked. The Armenians want to see normalization with Turkey, opening of the border, just proceed anyway. They say it's good for both countries. The Azerbaijanis sort of accepted that, signed the protocols, but simultaneously were hoping and asking everyone involved, we need some progress on the Karabakh issue. Armenia has to move forward if we're going to ratify these protocols. Between the signing and the ratification, nothing happened on the Karabakh issue, and basically, even though the Karabakh issue is not mentioned in the protocols, the Turks have now basically made this a precondition, and this is why we're so stuck. There have been differences on the Turkish side. President Gül was the one who flew to Armenia in September 2008 to a football match, soccer match in Yerevan, which kicked this whole thing off. Prime Minister Erdogan has consistently adopted a rather more aggressive tone towards Armenians, and has several times explicitly said that Armenia has to move forward on the Karabakh issue for the Turks to move forward on the protocols. So there have been some mixed messages here. The big question really is why the Turks signed protocols with Armenia which explicitly did not mention the word Azerbaijan or the word Karabakh. They clearly hoped that something would happen in parallel, that they could get some progress in parallel. They hoped maybe that someone would take care of the Azerbaijani factor. That didn't happen, and so they found themselves boxed in earlier this year. No progress on Karabakh. Azerbaijan extremely unhappy. Armenians insisting they move forward, and basically they just put a halt to the whole process. This really is one of the last closed borders in Europe. I mean, it's the edge of Europe, but it's still basically Europe. And it's a great anomaly, obviously, to have a closed border in a globalized world. I think, ultimately, in the long term, opening this border benefits everybody. Armenia really suffers from a bit of a siege mentality, which goes all the way back to 1915 and to all the problems they've had. They've got two borders closed, one with Azerbaijan, two of their four borders closed, one with Azerbaijan and one with Turkey. For them, opening this border basically ends their status as a regionally isolated country. They start to open up to the west. They share a border with a country that shares a border with has a customs union with the European Union. Economically, it's obviously good for Armenia. Transport costs go down. They have a new route for all their imports and exports, which currently go via Georgia or via Iran. But I think that's, again, a long-term thing. I don't think it's going to have an amazing transformation for the economy. But I think it's more of a kind of psychological aspect, as well as some economic benefits. For Turkey, it's partly about laying the ghosts of the past. It's partly about reaching some accommodation with Armenia over the issue of the genocide. Very importantly for them, it's also about kind of basically being able to put a stop to these resolutions in foreign parliaments calling what happened in 1915 genocide, which they assume would stop if there was normalization of relations with Armenia. And it's also about entering the Caucasus. This is a region to their northeast, and basically they don't really have a role there. They're strong allies with Azerbaijan. They have a fairly good relationship with Georgia, but while they don't have any relations with the third country, they can't really be an effective player in the Caucasus. So it's about expanding that role. Now, those are all benefits, but unfortunately, when they were put in the balance, the opposition, the antagonism of Azerbaijan, unfortunately for them, outweighed the benefits, and this is why, I'm afraid, we're still stuck. The US is obviously a key player in this process. The US has a huge Armenian-American population who have a very strong lobby in Congress. Probably the Armenian caucus is one of possibly the most powerful one after the Israel caucus in Congress, and also has obviously a strong relationship with Turkey, which is a member of NATO, a key player in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, on Cyprus, on all sorts of issues. So the US has a strong stake for different reasons in both countries. Having said that, it's really a conflict between two very different policies, because obviously the Armenia is more about domestic policy. It's more about reaching out to your Armenian-American population, which is why the April 24th question, how the American president honors the victims of the Armenian genocide, becomes important every April 24th. With Turkey, it's obviously not a domestic issue, it's a foreign policy security issue, so it's very different. So the US is constantly trying to balance these two issues, and sometimes does quite well, but I think the problem is it doesn't really have that much leverage with Turkey, and is also definitely obliged to honor its Armenian-American community. So often ends up sort of pleasing neither side. I think there has to be a better way of doing this, and the US is still struggling how to articulate a better policy. I mean, on April 24th, President Barack Obama issued what I thought was an extremely dignified statement on Armenian remembrance, saying, "Today we pause with them, with Armenians everywhere, to remember the awful events of 1915 with deep admiration for their contributions which transcend this dark past and give us hope for the future." Lots of very dignified words. And yet the ANCA, one of the main Armenian lobbying organizations, immediately issued a statement calling the statement disgraceful capitulation to Turkey's threats, simply because he had not used the word genocide. So I think, unfortunately, everyone's got a bit too sidetracked by will the president use or not use the G word, genocide. They haven't looked, which in turn kind of distracts from the broader issue, which is remembering and honoring what happened to all those Armenians back in 1915. And I think what needs to happen is there needs to be more engagement with Turkey, because, as I said, there is this growing dialogue within Turkey to address the past, to look at the question, what happened to all those missing Armenians? So I think there has to be ways for the US to kind of treat this as an issue of dialogue between Turkey and Armenia, and they're still struggling to know how to do that properly. What happens basically every year is that Congress, with the lobbying of the Armenia caucus and the Armenia lobby organizations, attempts to pass some kind of resolution every year on this issue. March the 4th, the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress passed a resolution, very narrowly passed, by the way, 23-22, calling the 1915 killings genocide. Turkey withdrew its ambassador. So Congress has become a player in this, and not necessarily in a very helpful way, because it's all become really about the one word, genocide. That they're in pursuit of this of Congress and the president using this G word, genocide. If they do, for them it's a victory. If they don't, it's a defeat. The broader objective, which is to get Turkey to address the issue and for the world to understand what happened to all these Armenians, I think is being lost. And what was hopeful about this process was that it was a way of normalizing relations between Turkey and Armenia, so that both sides could come to terms with the past. Unfortunately, the annual hand-wringing, the debate about the G word, I think has begun to get in the way of this kind of dialogue. we're now in a holding pattern. We're waiting to see what happens next. The process is basically frozen. Turkey has elections which are due next year. They could be brought forward to the end of this year, and obviously that will give, if the AKP gets re-elected in Turkey, that would give it more breathing space and could get back to the process. But there are some big ifs there. One is maybe the AKP won't get such a big majority in Parliament, and it's Parliament which needs to ratify the protocols. And the biggest problem is the Armenian-Azerbaijaini conflict, that basically Turkey needs the cover of some kind of progress on that conflict to move forward. The Armenians explicitly, however, don't want to link these two issues, and the talks themselves are pretty deadlocked. So it's not a very promising picture. What we have to hope is that work can go on in the meantime, filling some of the gaps in relations. There are many things you can do without necessarily opening the border. You can improve trade, you can improve transport links and contacts. You can even, the two sides could even exchange diplomatic notes, which means they have some kind of relations without opening embassies and things like that. So there are things that can be done. And on the Karabakh dispute, I always maintain that the international community, if it's serious, needs to invest many more resources into doing this, into doing something about this. It's really a very tiny group of people who are trying to resolve this conflict, and then they don't really have enough international support. So there are things that can be done, but basically we're unfortunately stuck in a vicious circle. The region, one thing that should really move the region on and have it change would be if Armenia and Turkey could open the border. But the two can't open the border because we're still stuck in negative regional dynamics, such as the Karabakh conflict.